was the hottest ever by the widest margin on record.
Earth has just experienced the hottest year since records began.
This is the worst drought to hit South Africa.
The building El Nino phenomenon will change weather from coast to coast.
12,000 square kilometers of coral are in danger of being wiped out.
Food sources for many of our people in the other islands goes with it.
There are climate change migrants, people who can no longer grow crops on their land.
Scientists are highlighting the urgency of cutting greenhouse gas emissions.
2015 is the hottest year ever recorded by mankind.
Over 750 deaths have been reported.
Powerful Category 5 storm is the strongest ever to hit the South Pacific nation.
Data published by US and UK meteorologists say the sharp increase in 2015 can be attributed to human activities, notably the burning of fossil fuels.
On fossil fuels.
Over the next few days, we will decide the fate of this planet.
Breaking news: after years of negotiation, a climate deal has finally been reached.
The real headline, the real news, is the voluntary aspect of this.
Yeah, not legally binding.
This is the same old thing. There's no enforcement mechanism.
The original goal was to limit emissions so the planet would only warm by 2 degrees Celsius. Every scientist who has looked at the agreement say that's not going to happen. The planet will still warm by 3.5 degrees by the end of the century. And that's not nearly enough to stop the very worst impacts of climate change from impacting the planet.
More needs to be done.
Coming out of this climate summit, we see a very clear gap. The politicians are not stepping up. We're seeing the people and the movement stepping up to close that gap.
There are groups around the world organising to shut down the fossil fuel industry during May 2016.
It's time that we begin to take the issues that impact our climate and our environment seriously.
Oil, gas, and coal need to be kept in the ground.
It is our future. We must say no.
The level of urgency is coming together very clearly worldwide.
What is legal is not necessarily just. We cannot simply confine ourselves to what the law offers for us to demand a different world. I remember the time when to even distribute flyers about the issue of oil was against the law. Things remain the way they are because we allow it. The moment we do not allow it, we take away our consent, then change happens very, very rapidly. In 1986, we were able to successfully oust the dictatorship Marcos. It was not just a struggle against repression of our civil and political liberties. It was also a struggle against a dictatorship that had many dirty and harmful energy projects. We create change through empowerment of people because we believe that's the only change that will last.
Makikita nyo siguro pagpunta nyo dito sa baybayin, may pagbabago ba sa kalagayan at ng kabuhayan, ng tirahan ng mga mamamayan na siya daw unang makikinabang sa pagtatayo ng ganitong klase ng enerhiya dahil sa mga ibibigay nitong mga trabaho, kalsada, paaralan, wala ka namang makikita.
Ako ngayon ay mag-aaling na po na 22 anyos pa ako nung tutulan natin simula kaswan. Ay ilang taon na ba ako nakikibaka? Ay ngayon dumami pa.
Totoo yan, tatay.
Paano mawawalan ako ng pag-asa? Matitigil pa ba? Ito ay dumami pa.
Hindi mo tayo nag-iisa. Halos sa buong mundo po, nananawagan na ang mamamayan ng mundo na itigil na ang pagtatayo ng mga power plant. At sa Mayo, tayo ho ay lalahok sa pangmundong aksyon laban sa coal.
We allow our nature to be destroyed by selfishness. And the progress that has been achieved is only for the few. The church has to educate our people to oppose this false progress. Globalization cannot be avoided. What is globalized is materialism, consumerism, lack of care for others. What must be globalized is concern for one another. The whole world is our responsibility. Everything that we do, we are responsible before God to make our world better each day. Most changes in society come from ordinary people who band themselves together and embrace the same vision and really sacrifice for the accomplishment of their common purpose. We have to protect every individual and we have to protect our environment.
The laws of nature and the laws of economics are in conflict at the moment. Either everything changes because the climate changes and it changes our physical world in ways that we can barely fathom, or we change our economy in fundamental ways. But the idea that there is some middle road where we continue on pretty much as is, that's actually not available to us.
Vancouver, like a lot of port cities in the Pacific Northwest, is being eyeballed to be a significant export point for a lot of fossil fuels. Kinder Morgan is, I think, the biggest, baddest project on the table right now. It would be expanding a pipeline currently moving 300,000 barrels of tar sands a day to close to 900,000 barrels a day. There's no way to clean up a tar sand spill in this kind of water. They're saying at best they could get, in ideal conditions, 50% cleaned up. If there's one thing about this part of the world, it's that ideal conditions are pretty few and far between. The pipeline itself crosses a lot of very important rivers for people's drinking water, for communities, for the salmon stocks, which are so important to this region, all the way as it goes back to northern Alberta, where we already know the impacts that it's having on the Athabasca River, which has become one of the most polluted waterways in the world, and the human health impacts that's having on First Nations communities downstream.
Alberta tar sands, the biggest industrial project in the world, where the size of Earth that they want to move is the size of Texas. Kinder Morgan make $13 million a day. And not only do they make that much, but they're subsidized by our Canadian government. We immobilized the community, 100% consensus by Tsleil-Waututh Nation, where we had a referendum and they said, we could negotiate for millions of dollars with Kinder Morgan. That could help some of our people out of poverty. Or we could use our own little resources that we have and fight them. 100% consensus, we chose to fight him.
So right here is home. We haven't left. This is where we've been for thousands of years. 85% of our diet came from the waters behind us. We've been measuring the quality of water here for about 20 years. It's getting progressively worse. We're devastated, and what we're trying to do is rehabilitate the damage that has caused. We're going to court soon, Canada, for not consulting us on the Kinder Morgan expansion. One of the ministers said, why don't the First Nations take the money? They need it. We don't need it more than our land. We'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen in any way possible.
A massive oil rig outfitted for Royal Dutch Shell's remote Arctic exploration parked in Seattle's harbor on Thursday. But not everyone is happy about it.
They have convinced us progress is only made through exploitation of the earth. Everyone is coming to protest. We have scientists, ecologists, and city council members who are willing to get arrested because they understand the severity of this moment. Stand up in whatever manner you can. This is our lunch counter to sit on. This is our history to be made. We hold the world in our hands. Thank you.
I've never been in the White House, but the ability to chain myself to the outside of the White House turned out to be important and empowering, and anyone can do it. Most of us don't have huge sums of money. All of us have a body that we can put in the way. I want to say very clearly that civil disobedience is but one tool in the activist toolbox. It's not the first one that you should reach for, and if you use it all the time, like any other tool, it's going to get dull. That said, civil disobedience has a role to play. Nobody should have to go to jail about climate change. In a rational system, that would be the last thing that would happen. But because the way power is distributed in our world, sometimes we have to.
One of the central threats to democracy today is the corporate capture of government. We are up against tremendous resources, and those resources are smart. The corporation goes straight to the politician that's going to be on the committee that's going to pass the law that they want to pass and threatens their re-election at exactly the right time. The strategy of global corporations on climate change was partly to recognize that they had a trump card with the United States government. They could stand in the way of global action by blocking American action. There's a level of state failure in the United States. The legislature is bought and paid for by oil companies and other companies. We have to roll back corporate capture of our governments if we want to try and fix these problems that conflict directly with their industry bottom line.
There's nothing radical about anything we're talking about. Radicals work at oil companies. If you are willing to get up in the morning and make your fortune by altering the chemical composition of the atmosphere, and you're willing to do it once scientists have told you what would happen, and once you've seen it happen, once you've watched the Arctic start to melt, if you're willing to do that, then you're a radical, and our job is to try and check that radicalism.
An investigation is underway into ExxonMobil. The huge oil company buried research about the effects of climate change.
Reports suggest more than 30 years ago, Exxon's own scientists were taking climate change projections into account in its operational plans.
Exxon was on the cutting edge of science. They wanted to be on the cutting edge of science 40 years ago on climate change. They understood that farther down the road, if the science was accurate, there would be limits placed on emissions from fossil fuels. So their strategy at that time was that we want to have a say in what those limits look like.
When their senior scientists told their senior executives what was coming, Exxon started making sure that all its drilling rigs were climate-proofed so that they could withstand the rising sea level. But they did not tell the rest of us. Just the opposite.
Around 1989, there was a shift in the thinking at the executive level. And that was when Exxon joined this group called the Global Climate Coalition, which sounds very green. But in fact, they were put together to fight any policy reaction to climate change.
Exxon and others ended up hiring the veterans of the tobacco industry to try and make the same basic argument that the cigarette guys had made.
After 3 decades of investigation, no causal link between smoking and disease has been established.
Scientific evidence remains inconclusive as to whether human activities affect the global climate.
It was effective, and it cost us a generation's worth of time.
We just recently crossed 400 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere. We're literally releasing all of that CO2 that got buried underneath Earth's surface over 100 million years. And we're releasing it over a time frame of 100 years, 1 million times faster than nature buried it. That is without precedent. It's unclear that living things, including human beings, can adapt to changes that occur that quickly.
In the Philippines, at least 6,000 farmers were blocking a highway to demand the government provide rice.
The farmers are starving. Behind all this is a rise in global temperatures, causing the whole region to suffer the worst drought in more than 20 years.
We've begun to see serious stress on the global food systems. We simply won't be able to grow enough food to feed 10 billion people in a warming world.
A new study published yesterday finds climate change exacerbated the worst drought ever in modern Syria, aggravating social unrest in the country and helping to push it over the brink into civil war.
A record 1 million refugees and migrants have now crossed into Europe in Europe's worst refugee crisis since the Second World War.
In other words, the very real security threat posed by climate change is only going to get worse.
Biz bu kirliliğe karşı burada Ali Ağa bölgesinde, yani sanayi bölgesi adı altında yapılan bu fütursuz sanayileşmeye karşı yıllardır bir mücadele içindeyiz.
Kapitalizmin hakim olduğu bir süreci yaşadık. Genelde onu yaşıyoruz. Şimdi özel şirketler etütleri yapıyorlar kendileri aralarında. Biz karşı çıkmaya çalışsak da, karşı çıksak da ikinci bir çevre hareketiyle kendileri çevre etütü yaparak bu sayfaları
tesisler yeni yapılırken, daha yeni işletmeye girerken, büyürken falan oraya işçi alınacağını, oradan para kazanılacağını çok kandırıldılar.
Her zaman var mı?
Bunu
bu her zaman için geçerli.
Anladık.
Yılda yapılacak sigara. 1989'un Mart'ında arkadaşlarımla birlikte belediye başkanı seçildikten sonra Ankara'dan bir Çevre Genel Müdürlüğü'nden bir bayan telefon etti. Dedi ki, tanışmıyoruz ama önemli olduğu için size Ali Ağa için bir kara haber vereceğim. Ali Ağa'da ithal kömüre dayalı 1000 megawatt gücünde bir termik santral kurulacak. Şili'den Kınağa kadar bütün belediye başkanlarını çağırdık. Türkiye'de vahşi kapitalizmin bir göstergesi olarak Ali Ağa'da başlayacak olan bir saldırı.
Termik santral kurulmaz. Halkımız istemiyor çünkü.
Termik santral alanına ağaçlarımızı, çocuklarımızla, evrim coşkunlarla, yavrularımızla dikeceğiz. Gücünüz yetiyorsa gelin söndürün.
Kulakları çınlasın, İzmir Büyükşehir Belediye Başkanı'ydı o zaman. Yüksel Çakbu ve bizim 18 belediyemiz yine bir sevgi zinciriyle protesto ettik. Aşağı yukarı 60 kilometrelik bir alanda 50 bin kişinin katıldığı bir çevre hareketi. Bunu o gün yaptığımızda belki de Türkiye'de şimdiye kadar yapılmış olan çevre hareketlerinin içerisinde en çok ilgi gören eylem oldu.
Bu sanayi, burada bizim verdiğimiz mücadele orada sadece bir termik santralı durdurabildik. Ama geniş bir alandaki sanayinin devam etmesini engelleyemedik.
Bugün Ala'da bile bir yeni termik santral kurulur vaziyette kurulmaya devam ediyor. Kimse ses çıkarmıyor. Oradaki insanlar adeta bizi kovalayacaklardı. Ve yani bizim geçim kaynağımızı yok ediyorsunuz. Bunu açıkça söylüyorlar, dediler. Benim burada bir kanser oluyorsunuz, ölüyorsunuz dedik. Şekli olacak dedi ama işimiz yok dedi. Aç uyuyoruz.
Yani biraz insanları açlıkla terbiye etme gibi bir şey değil mi? Ya.
Ben onları iki belediye otobüsüne bindirdim, yatağına götürdüm. Yatağında nasıl etkilendiklerini anlatan bir köye var. Hatta birinin burnu tavşan burnu gibiydi. Birisinin kulağı yarımdı falan. Onlar anlattılar. Yatağın termik santralinden kaynaklanan sakat doğum oldu. Dönüşte tüm horoz yediği şeydi, eylemdi.
Bir eylem planımız var. Bu eylem planımıza da Türkiye'deki fosil yakıtı karşıtı bütün yaşam savunucuları, uluslararası fosil yakıt karşıtı yaşam savunucularını buraya davet ediyoruz. Hep birlikte el ele bu fosil yakıtlardan kaynaklı kötü gidişe bir son vermek istiyoruz.
Biz bu 90 ruhunu tekrardan yaşatacağız.
Lignite has a very low energy density. That means you have to dig up a lot of it to get not that much energy. And in burning it, you emit a whole bunch of other dirt, essentially, which is why this is not just bad for the climate, it's also terrible for people's health. Germany produces and burns more lignite than any other country in the world in absolute terms, including India and China. We look at this now and we see the dirtiest of all the fossil fuels being dug up. And of course, it is the central driver of climate change, which is a central driver of conflict, hunger, destitution, deprivation around the world. This stuff has to be left in the ground. This little town called Proschim produces 100% of its own electricity from renewables and still exports stuff into the grid. Like, this village is actually the future we need. Here you have agriculture, biogas, solar power, you have a functioning community, and this is the front line in the struggle against the madness of profit-driven extraction. The government has slated Proschim for destruction because there's coal underneath this. What we're seeing here is the future being eaten by the past. Fossil fuels are the past in more than one way. They are the past of capital, they are the past of energy, they are the past of our relationship to nature. And it... Hallo, genau, wir können auch von Ihrem Land runtergehen, wenn Sie das stört. Okay, so this was Frau Rösch, who was just asking what we're doing on her land. And I started explaining, blah, blah, we're doing this film. Then she's like, are you against lignite? Yeah. It's like, okay, then you can walk wherever you want. Folks lived here a few years ago. This was their lives. The government said, you can't be here because we're going to dig this up because there's coal underneath. They had grown up here. They were planning to maybe die here. These kinds of images, that's also why we're doing this. There's folks here being evicted from their homes because we cannot stop destroying the environment. This cannot go on.
All the political work that you're doing when you're mobilizing for a big disobedient action will ultimately be for naught if the action isn't a success in tactical terms. I'm going to tell you the situation as it was last year. Here is the open cast mine guards viola. This whole area was our action target. Now, there are always two kinds of obstacles that you need to bear in mind. The first is geographic, or let's call them technical obstacles. Then, second challenge, police and corporate security, let's call these human or political problems. Our goal is not to fight the police, our goal is to get around them, because they're not our enemy. Our enemy is the lignite production inside the pit. So when the police start forming a line, with sheer determination, we are walking through the police lines, not hitting them, not engaging them violently, but just walking through. We ensure that all of the 4 action groups manage to get into the pit.
I've been doing civil disobedience actions for 17, 18 years now. It's very hard to get a sense of empowerment, to actually really feel in every fiber in your body that you can make it. We can actually stop this. The moment when we were running towards these diggers and we saw that they were all shut down, I remember this moment of like, we've done it. It was an unbelievable moment of personal and collective empowerment in a struggle that all too often seems brutally hopeless. In May, we're going to be more people, and hopefully they won't be able to stop us. Last year they couldn't, so let's see if we can do this again. We think we can.
If you say you can't deal with climate change without a revolution in values, a revolution in the way we think, people will say, well, we don't have time for that kind of thing. The truth is, what we don't have time for is continuing to try the same thing that hasn't worked for 2.5 decades.
We continue to be inspired by ordinary people having the courage to stand up against corporate interests, even against government policies that will bring harm to their communities.
Hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable.
We don't have the tanks and we don't have the armed forces. Non-violent civil disobedience is me making my voice heard against a powerful force that is holding us back.
Keystone turned out to be a great victory because all over the country and the world, people looked up and saw, you actually can beat big oil.
It may seem impossible right now to prevent climate chaos, but social movements have shown that the limits of the possible are there to be moved.
My hope is that we come out the other side of this with the global sense of a new kind of power in the climate movement.
What we need are new ways to do new things.
To practice civil disobedience is necessary to be able to pursue a better life for our people.
Batangas now is the center of action against fossil fuel.
It's quite possible that a more radical approach will bring rapid change.
It's straight math. How many people are active and engaged on this issue? How hard are they pushing? How coordinated are they? It's the people who are engaged that determine what government does. And all we have is a choice to make about whether we're going to be one of those people or not.
The science is pretty dark and things are changing very fast. But I am absolutely sure there is going to be one hell of a fight.
Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the earth coming up. Wow, isn't that pretty? You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick. Oh man, that's great. Where is it? Quick. Oh, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot.
From the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
There is new and dramatic evidence of what's happening to our world, and tonight we'll look at the impact already being felt.
The red flags about extreme weather we've all endured together all across the globe.
We are literally engaged in an unprecedented experiment with the one planet that we know of that can support life.
We will respond to the threat of climate change, knowing that the failure to do so would betray our children and future generations.
The big question mark is the future, of course, and a new kind of normal.
Gearing up for the UN-hosted climate change summit in New York. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon will host the summit.
I will convene a climate summit for leaders at the highest level. I urge political leaders of the world to prioritize their political energy on climate change.
We have to get serious about bringing real commitments to the table for that summit.
If things go business as usual, we will not live, we will die.
Climate tipping points are scary, but if we stay connected to each other, we'll have power to create the movement tipping point on climate change, the one that takes our leaders from this place of inaction and puts them on a journey towards saving the planet.
All of the big social movements in history have had people in the streets. Women's voting rights, civil rights movement, and even more recently on climate issues, our big successes have happened when people left their homes and went out into the streets.
This is a bigger fight than, in fact, has ever been won. We need to save the systems that make the Earth compatible with human existence and the existence of other life forms.
This is the fight of our time, but none of us should exactly have to be activists about all this. In a rational world, the fact that scientists had said the worst thing on Earth is happening now, and here's what you can do to stop it, that would have been enough to push our systems into action.
Yeah, of all the things that probably get me most upset, it's when people start presenting climate change as if it's something new. The science behind our understanding of man-made climate change is very, very old and very well established. So the task we've taken on is documenting this history to help us understand where we are, how we got here, and how we can change course. Scientists have known for more than 150 years that carbon dioxide was a greenhouse gas.
Fourier came up with this notion that there were gases in our atmosphere that allowed sunlight to pass through like a window,
But then when sunlight bounced off the Earth's surface, they trapped the heat in, right? So you had now this establishment of what we now call the greenhouse effect.
In the 1850s, John Tyndall made laboratory measurements of the absorption of heat radiation by carbon dioxide. And he concluded that if you change the CO2 in the atmosphere, it's going to affect the planetary energy balance.
Tyndall was the one who really came along and proved that carbon dioxide was a natural thermostat that helped set our planet's temperature.
In the late 1800s, it was the great Swedish chemist Arrhenius who first did the calculations about what would happen as we, as he put it, evaporated our coal mines into the air. But people didn't pay much attention to that in the 20th century because we were too busy figuring out cool new ways to burn fossil fuel. It was only in the late 1950s that we even bothered to measure to see if it was accumulating in the atmosphere. That instrument, which went up on the side of Mauna Loa in Hawaii, is the most important scientific instrument in the world. Beginning in 1959, it found that there was a steadily accumulating amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, the so-called Keeling curve.
The Keeling curve is one of the most important pieces of scientific work of the 20th century that shows us that carbon dioxide has been rising continuously and systematically since the Industrial Revolution.
Keeling didn't just show that there was an increase in carbon dioxide, he also pinpointed the source. And what Keeling showed so incredibly was that roughly 1 out of every 4 CO2 molecules in our atmosphere today were put there by us.
Just a year ago, we passed 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, the pre-industrial level was about 280 parts per million. So human society in the industrial era has raised the level of CO2 in the atmosphere by about 40%, and many people fear that before we're done, we're going to double it or even triple it.
We're pumping CO2 into the atmosphere at a speed which we have never seen before in modern human history. We are absolutely racing into uncharted territory.
In our lifetime, human beings left behind the Holocene, this 10,000-year period of benign climatic stability that coincides with the rise of human civilization. We have crossed a great threshold, and we stand on the edge of others.
I remember when the Weather Channel was this kind of like nice, sleepy little station. Now it's like a horror show. The climate is being disrupted. That's not for next year or 1,000 years from now. That's happening right now.
What all climate scientists will agree on is that the entire atmosphere has changed. All the atmospheric dynamics have changed. So every event that happens now is in the context of climate change, is different from how it would have been.
Typhoon slammed the Philippines with winds of 195 miles per hour. That's higher than the winds from Hurricane Sandy and Katrina combined.
The world is mobilizing to help the Philippines, but just a trickle of food and water and medicine has reached the victims of Typhoon Haiyan.
More than 1 million people were forced to flee their homes, many now trying to salvage what's left.
Hundreds of thousands are thronging relief centers, desperate for life's necessities.
Many residents covered their faces to mask the smell of the dead while they searched for relatives in some of the hardest hit areas.
This is one of the top storms ever seen on this planet.
Mr. President, Your Excellency, what my country is going through as a result of this extreme climate event is madness. Super Typhoon Haiyan made landfall in my own family's hometown. And the devastation is staggering. I struggle to find words to describe how I feel about the losses. To anyone outside who continues to deny and ignore the reality that is climate change, I dare them to get off their ivory towers and away from the comfort of their armchairs. I dare them to go to the islands of the Pacific. We refuse as a nation to accept a future where super typhoons like Haiyan become a way of life. We refuse to accept that running away from storms, evacuating our families, counting our dead become a way of life. We simply refuse to. We can fix this. We can stop this madness.
Scientists had been saying for a long time that climate change might occur, but 1988 is the year when Jim Hansen and his team at NASA say, both in the scientific peer-reviewed literature and in public, that it's actually happening.
The changes in atmospheric composition that humans were making was going to have a big impact on the Earth's climate.
The greenhouse effect has been detected, and it is changing our climate now.
Hansen's testimony was reported on the front page of the New York Times, and there was actually a bill introduced into Congress, the National Energy Policy Act, to immediately begin to phase out the use of fossil fuels in order to prevent disruptive climate change. And of course, that was supported by the creation of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that year. So there was political momentum, there was scientific momentum, there was strong scientific evidence, there was media attention, and then the whole thing kind of fell apart.
The Earth Summit, a 12-day, 178-nation conference on the environment, began today in Rio de Janeiro. Battle lines are already drawn between the haves and the have-nots.
So far, all the agreements are non-binding, requiring no specific action on the environment.
As time has gone on, the scientific warnings keep intensifying, and yet there has been no effective political response. All political efforts to get a handle on this issue have essentially failed.
I am the one that is burdened with finding the balance between sound environmental practice on the one hand and jobs for American families on the other.
The agreement hammered out in Kyoto, Japan, requires industrialized nations to make substantial cuts in greenhouse gas emissions.
The United States actually never ratified the Kyoto Protocol, which is one reason it didn't work.
President Bush ignited a storm of controversy when he decided to abandon the Kyoto Protocol, which sets caps on the emissions of greenhouse gases in developed nations.
For nearly 2 weeks, the U.S. delegation had blocked proposal after proposal, draft after draft, refusing to even discuss mandatory cuts in greenhouse emissions.
Now we switch to the big climate conference going on in Copenhagen.
Today, developing countries made themselves heard.
People are dying.
Led by Africa, 135 nations, including India and China, staged a 5-hour boycott, angry over what they say are insufficient carbon cuts proposed by the world's rich countries.
If Hollywood had been writing the story, it all would have come right in the end, and all the nations would have pledged their best effort. And nothing like that happened. The thing was a fiasco, a failure.
The frustrations of the last 10 days explode on the streets of Copenhagen. Outside the Bella Center, where negotiators still haven't reached a climate agreement, 2,500 protesters try to storm the hall to make an impact.
Nothing happened because the fossil fuel industry was still strong enough to scare nations into avoiding the issue.
What happened in Copenhagen for a lot of people was this realization: no leader was coming to save us.
We have to be strong enough to scare our national leaders into doing the right thing.
Welcome to this press conference to present the report of IPCC Working Group 3 on mitigation of climate change.
The way we've approached climate change is the scientific community builds the case, it synthesizes the evidence, it presents that evidence then to the policymakers. We've proven beyond a doubt that climate change is real, that the Earth's temperature is warming, that warming is predominantly caused by the burning of fossil fuels and other human activities, and that additional warming poses a significant threat. What the policymaking community did was they came up with a definition of what they called dangerous human interference.
In 2009, the nations of the world agreed on a target of 2 degrees centigrade or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit of maximum warming above the pre-industrial level. That would require emissions worldwide almost entirely stopping within a matter of decades.
A lot of people talk about 2 degrees being the safe level. Well, there is no safe level. 2 degrees is a
round number that would be safer, but we'll still have substantial climate impacts.
1 degree is melting the Arctic and the Antarctic. We'd be crazy to find out what 2 degrees will do, but we're probably going to find out. Even if we do everything right at this point, that's about as good an outcome as we can hope for. The same leaders who say they want the temperature to go up no more than 2 degrees have put forward a series of proposals that, when you add them up, leads to the temperature rising 6 degrees.
It's almost a kind of refusal to come to grips with reality. There's just this enormous gap between what countries say they want to do and what they're actually on track to do. People call this the emissions gap.
Much of this is about mathematics. You got to leave 80% of fossil fuel in the ground. Fossil fuel industry wants to burn all its reserves. If they do, then we get that 6 degrees.
Each day of inaction, each day of business as usual, puts us closer and closer on this crash course.
If you think for a second about this, there was this just layer of stuff under the ground, got put there at a specific time in a specific way, and it just captured millennia of solar energy. And we just happened upon it. It's like if you were just walking around and then like, oh, you put something in the ground, there's just millions of dollar bills down there. You're just like pulling them out. Everything about what we do and who we are and how we live is dependent upon the fact that we just found this stuff sitting there. And that stuff said, oh, you don't have to have everyone working in the fields all the time. You can have cities, you can have cars, you can have iPhones. And the way I view it is, as incredible as that stuff is, we've been paying this price on it the whole time, right? And there's this clock running.
The classic market failure is negative environmental externalities. That's just jargon for you're not paying the full costs of the fossil fuels that you burn.
The racket that the fossil fuel industry has run is to take costs of its product and export them to the public.
Think about, the litany of impacts from sea level rise, ocean acidification, the collapse of ecosystems that we rely on for food, water availability. These things are really expensive. When you have huge wildfires, it costs a lot of money. All of those costs are being dumped onto us as a society and not being paid by people who are polluting.
These big, massive polluters get to dump megatons of carbon in the atmosphere for free. You can't pollute for free. If you litter, you get a fine.
That makes coal and oil and other fossil fuels more competitive against solar and wind and other sources than they deserve to be. Behind the environmental problems that carbon pollution causes and behind the economic problems is a political problem that a very small group of very powerful special interests have exerted very rough control over the political establishment.
We're up against the fossil fuel lobby that has complete access to the political class and the ability to bribe through legal means and blackmail through the use of attack ads and so on. Even people who oppose them have trouble opposing them too strongly because they're in some ways economically dependent on them.
Right now, we have a monopoly control by big carbon polluters. They grant themselves subsidy after subsidy. Think about this. How much money does the Pentagon spend helping big private oil companies get their for-profit products from the Middle East here? About half the Pentagon's budget is just helping Chevron and Shell and Exxon get their for-profit product here. What if they had to pay for that service? How much would gas cost then? Plus, they also get all kind of tax breaks and other kind of loopholes.
They're in a system based on a grow or die ethic. Rather than respond to the climate crisis by scaling back, they're doubling down through fracking, through tar sands oil, through coal exports, mountaintop removal. They have become more brazen.
It's a rogue industry. It's an industry whose business plan is followed to the letter will wreck the planet. Once you know that, then you know that these are now illegitimate business plans. we have to figure out how to disassociate ourselves with them. And that is beginning to happen all over the world.
On the great lawn of Central Park, I was up on a stage probably 70 feet in the air, looking out at that sea of people stretching out farther than the eye could see. The crowd estimates later were larger than 1 million people.
April the 22nd, 1970. The grassroots mobilization which we recall as the first Earth Day. 20 million Americans called away from their jobs and their classes into the streets of their communities.
When Nixon was looking at television at these huge crowds in city after city after city across the country, he apparently muttered to Ehrlichman, man, a lot of those people have got to be Republican. And Republicans needed him to do something for them on this issue, he felt, and it was Nixon, arguably one of the most anti-environmental presidents in American history, who felt compelled to sign the Clean Air Act.
I think the things that we've been doing to date are a reason to give us a little bit of hope. We've seen a degree of responsiveness on the part of the House of Representatives and on the part of the U.S. Senate.
In a matter of 3 years, we passed the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, National Environmental Policy Act, the Environmental Education Act, Superfund. I'd go so far as to say that with the possible exception of the New Deal, it was the most fundamental restructuring of the ground rules of the American economic system that the nation has experienced.
This is not just about the environment. It's about the community. It's about public health. It's about jobs. It's about justice.
It was labor that got this city up and moving.
Yes. Yes.
And it'll be labor that continues to move this city. We are the community. Are we not the community?
For our people who have been at the front line, not being able to breathe, suffering from asthma, upper respiratory, pulmonary disease, cancer clusters because of environmental racism.
Climate change exacerbates every kind of social injustice that faith communities have fought against for thousands of years. And we will not stop marching and praying and acting until we have a strong climate treaty.
We got a movement, brothers and sisters, and we got to stay together.
The people united will never be defeated.
It's only by accident that we even think of climate change as an environmental issue. You could just as easily think of it as another example of what happens in an unequal society. The people who've contributed the least to climate change and who've benefited the least from the use of fossil fuel are the first people to feel the effects. People in the poorest parts of the world suffer enormously already and will suffer enormously more as the century wears on.
Climate disruption is a social justice issue. Who gets hit first and worst every time there's one of these weather disasters? It's low-income people, it's people of color, it's people who can't get out of harm's way, and people who can't bounce back easily because they don't have the money or the social standing or the political connections.
Our communities are disproportionately impacted. We're all seeing that it's the indigenous people, the people of color, the low-income people who have historically suffered the burden of so many other politically driven crises.
There are so many countries that have been systematically plundered over hundreds of years, and this is often described as an ecological debt, climate debt. The whole idea that there are disposable places was always a racist idea, the idea of sacrifice zones, just treating people in places like garbage.
The place where it's hardest for it to sink in is in the suburban United States. We're insulated against the natural world. That's what the suburbs really are, a way of making you not notice the natural world very much. And we're insulated in those places by wealth. At least we think we are.
Scientists are screaming from the rooftops about us avoiding going over a 2-degree rise in the temperature of the planet. Why are they so worried about that? If we go over that amount of warming, there are feedback loops in our ecosystems. tipping points that climate change could spin out of control, and it happens like that.
There are switches that can be tripped where suddenly you are in brand new territory and you don't even begin to know what to do about it. This is not a linear kind of problem that we're dealing with. This is very much an exponential kind of problem.
Right now, we're on the edge of 3 major tipping points. The first one is the Arctic ice cap. That ice cap's like a mirror. It reflects the sun's light off of the Earth and keeps it from warming us up. But as it melts, you get a smaller mirror, which means a warmer Earth, which means more melting, which means more climate change. Another example is Arctic methane. We've got a gigantic amount of methane gas frozen into the tundra, and it is 50 times as toxic as CO2 is. It's CO2 on steroids. As it warms, and that methane gets released, it then causes global warming to get worse, which means it warms more, which means more methane released, which means worse warming, and all of that process spins out of control. Another example of a tipping point is ocean acidification. As you get more CO2 in the atmosphere, a lot of it actually is going into our oceans. And a lot of stuff, like plankton, can't live in that kind of acidified water. And plankton is the basis of the food chain. If the plankton die, we lose the whole ocean ecosystem.
These kinds of feedback loops and tipping points are what keep me up at night, that we will hit one before we're able to turn things around.
Even if we went cold turkey today because of the time lags in our climate system, we've already signed up for things that we can't see yet.
We live in a razor-thin livable universe. Just a few kilometers below my feet, it's too hot to live. Just a few kilometers above my head, the air is too thin to breathe. It's not about a few more droughts and a few more storms. It's about a catastrophic shift in this fragile balance of our biosphere that threatens everything we love.
There's a lot of things that we pay attention to, that we focus on, that are fun, but they are short-lived and they are not for the betterment of us. We have to reprioritize what's important to us. Our environment isn't just ice caps melting in Antarctica. We're the ones who face the problems day to day. If you're breathing in smog or your little brother has asthma, that's environmental injustice. And those are things that we have the power to push back on. Imagine being the person who changes the face of climate change so that we don't have to deal with those impacts every day.
So on September 21st, we're gonna march for climate justice. So who's with us? Come on,
Change doesn't happen because people decide to stay home and click like on Facebook. Change happens because people like you and I decide to get involved.
We didn't want to leave it to world leaders. Their track record is not very good in dealing with this question.
I am a trade unionist, and I am an environmentalist, and I see no conflict whatsoever in those two things. It's in our core self-interest as a trade union movement to help build the path to a sustainable future and get on the right side of the climate change issue sooner rather than later.
Normally it takes a long time to switch energy sources, 50, 60 years to go from wood to coal, coal to oil and gas. We lack 50, 60 years.
The reason we want to get off of fossil fuels now is because we have to protect our way of life.
We need a vision for what the post-carbon economy looks like that is inspiring enough and delivers enough in terms of jobs, in terms of new opportunities, in terms of better health. It has to be exciting.
There are many more jobs available to people who are going to be building wind turbines, retrofitting houses so they waste less energy.
Solar panels have to be installed by a person. That person has to go to your home. There's no way to outsource putting that solar panel onto a roof.
A 100% renewable economy is within our grasp. It's economically and technologically possible. It's not something that we need to keep researching because it's always off in the distance. No, it's here. It's a question of political will. If you look at the renewable revolution that's happened in Germany, it wasn't about leaving the renewable sector to the market. It was about creating different incentives. And there was an explosion of innovation and creativity.
Germany is now the #1 solar country in the world, even though they have the same amount of solar incidents as Alaska.
Can we do it? Can we take the power that has been highly centralized and highly focused and controlled by very few hands, and it is not an accident that very few hands controlling power in the sense of electricity leads to very few hands controlling power in the sense of political power. We are going to try a global experiment that is going to be the most difficult thing human beings have ever done, which is to rip those two apart, which means we are democratizing power in both senses of the word.
A Canadian company called TransCanada wants to build the Keystone XL pipeline. The $13 billion system would carry crude oil from the so-called tar sands region in Alberta to Houston, Texas for refining.
The Keystone XL pipeline has become a huge focus of controversy. The tar sands oil is particularly dirty, it's particularly carbon intensive.
An estimated 2,000 environmental activists from across the continent plan to gather in Washington, D.C. to launch a 2-week protest.
It has become a symbol to both sides in this debate, where the people who want further development of fossil fuels see getting Keystone through as core to their strategy, and on the other side, the climate activists see it as a symbolic fight that they have to win.
I'm here as a Nebraska citizen and landowner.
I am on the advisory board of the Center for Health and the Global Environment at Harvard Medical School.
I'm an evangelical Christian. I'm a proud member of the Transport Workers Union of America.
You know what's so fascinating about this whole Keystone thing is that was supposed to be a wedge, and instead it's been turned upside down. Now it's actually a base that is lining up constituency after constituency.
Today we act! Today we send a message to them and everybody else. We are taking back our futures!
Something extraordinary and unexpected has backfired out of the ambition of the fossil fuel companies. They've built a movement by mistake.
If you are going to be risking arrest, you're going to be lining up over here.
One of the tools that came into play was peaceful civil disobedience to show the moral urgency of these problems, that this was the crisis of our time. I saw a story in one of the trade publications, the oil industry, not long ago, and they said, we're never going to get to build another pipeline in peace again. And I hope they're right.
As scientists, we study this out of this fascination and kind of awe of this whole system that we call home. We are on this planet that is so perfectly built to sustain life. We got so lucky. And then you begin to think, what do you do with this knowledge, this unbearable, incredibly depressing knowledge? That the decision to burn fossil fuels was a decision that had tremendous downside risks that we didn't realize immediately.
When I read a climate science article that talks about mid-century projections, what I read is what's going to happen when my kid is 40. That's what I see on the page. And for me, it is absolutely my responsibility then to do whatever it takes to protect my child.
Alice Walker says that resistance is the secret of joy. And I don't know if it's the secret of joy, but I know it is definitely the secret of staving off depression. The reality we're facing is very grave. So how do you not get depressed about it? Well, one way you don't get depressed is by work.
Things change for lots of different reasons. There's all kinds of dynamics, but one central element is people being in the streets.
All of us must stand up together and say, no more.
We live in a culture that doesn't tell us our own history, doesn't tell us the history of social movement wins. And the times in our past when masses of people have taken the wheel of history and turned it.
It was only 1% of Americans that ever took part in a civil rights demonstration, but they were able to change our society enough to stand up to those powers that be.
I think this march will go down as one of the greatest, if not the greatest, demonstrations for freedom and human dignity ever held in the United States.
Martin Luther King always said that the victories that had been won so far were the ones that were cheapest to the status quo. Giving legal rights and giving voting rights doesn't cost the system nearly as much as providing good jobs and good infrastructure and good schools.
We as a people will get to the promised land.
Big victories have been won before, but nothing on the scale of the economic challenge that really responding to the climate crisis represents. We have a responsibility to rise to our historical moment.
We are going around the world to say the time has come.
If we're going to have a movement worthy of the name, solidarity among all these different causes needs to be the foremost principle.
It's this broad and powerful spectrum of allies that has the political weight to move the dial on this. There's a tipping point coming where the online movements are going to move offline.
If we can just push this to a point where there is a social tipping point, we really can move forward on this issue.
We will not be stopped.
Take action right now. This is the issue I will vote on. This is the issue I will give money on. This is the issue that I will scream at the top of my lungs into a bullhorn over.
There's a line that divides good from evil, and it runs down the middle of every single person. When we prevail, it won't just be because we beat the worst instincts of other people. It'll be because we overcame the worst instincts and the worst fears even within ourselves.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We turn now to the People's Climate March. Organizers estimate as many as 400,000 people marched in New York Sunday in the largest climate protest in history. The turnout far exceeded expectations. Other marchers and rallies were held in 166 countries. More protests are planned for today. Climate activists are gathering today in downtown Manhattan for a mass sit-in dubbed Flood Wall Street. The actions are timed to coincide with the United Nations Climate Summit taking place here in New York Tuesday. President Obama and over 100 other world leaders are scheduled to attend. Sunday's events in New York began with an indigenous sunrise ceremony in Central Park. Indigenous activists then led the march. Democracy Now!'s Aaron Mate was in the streets at the People's Climate March.
We're near the very front of the People's Climate March, and the sign behind me reads, "Front lines of crisis, forefront of change." This march has been divided up into different groups, and at the front are indigenous and frontline communities most impacted by climate change.
My name is Clayton Thomas Mueller. I'm an organizer with the Indigenous Peoples Social Movement, Idle No More, and Defenders of the Land. Things today are going really, really well. We've got tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people on the street. We have frontline Indigenous communities from communities that are disproportionately affected by President Obama's all-of-the-above energy policy. We've got leaders from communities fighting fracking, fighting tar sands pipelines, all kinds of pipeline fighters from across the continent who are organizing in solidarity with First Nations from the belly of the beast in Alberta who are trying to stop tar sands expansion at the source. And we're here to send a very clear message to President Obama, Stephen Harper, and the rest of the world leaders that we need legally binding mechanisms on climate change right now passed. And if they ain't going to do it, then the people certainly will.
And we're here to march for the next 7 generations and to take a stand against big oil companies that are coming through our territories and trying to take our ancestral lands and destroy them. We're here because it's going to take all of us, not just the indigenous people, but everyone in the whole world to come together to save our water.
We are from the Peruvian delegation here on the march, and we are marching because we are fighting for climate justice, and we are fighting because this December, the next COP is going to be in our country. And we are preparing a People's Summit, and the next march is in December 10 in Lima. And we are asking the Peruvian government, Ollantumala, for coherence, because even if they are taking pictures here near Ban Ki-moon, they are not doing that kind of commitments in the country. So we need to fight here, we need to fight in our country. This is a global fight.
I'm the executive director of El Puente. We have about 300 strong here of our young people. We are a human rights organization located in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. Most of our young people are from Puerto Rico, from Dominican Republic, and the connection between what's happening in terms of our islands and also what's happening here in our waterfront community that Williamsburg is part of. We need really the powers that be to come together with our people and really make decisions that are about preserving our earth.
My name is Carlos Garcia. I'm the Secretary-Treasurer of the New York State Public Employees Federation. We represent 54,000 New York State employees who are professional, scientific, and technical workers, and we're out here to say to the U.S. government, New York State government, let's take care of our climate, let's take care of our environment.
My name is Irene Jor. I'm with the National Domestic Workers Alliance with the New York domestic workers here today. And for us, we're here because as domestic workers, it's time to clean up the climate mess. Domestic workers, we want climate justice now. Domestic workers have been part of the struggle for a long time. We're disproportionately impacted by climate change. For those of us who are migrant women workers, we often come here because of what extractive resources and climate crisis has done to our home countries.
What do we do?
We've come upon a huge contingent of young people, many carrying signs reading "Youth Choose Climate Justice."
Obama, we don't want no climate drama. Hey, Obama, we don't want no climate drama.
My name is Yona Feldman. I'm here with the Brandeis Divestment Campaign from Brandeis University.
And what does your sign say?
It says, divest from climate change.
We believe that our university should sell off all its investments in the fossil fuel industry. That's in coal, oil, natural gas, tar sands, and reinvest into clean, renewable alternatives.
Well, my name is Louis Navarro. I'm 16. I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I'm with the Boston Area Youth Organizing Project. Well, as a youth, I feel like every youth should be a part of this because it concerns them and their future, whether or not if they could live by 20 years from now with this climate change. And I feel like it's important for me to be here to show them that the youth is on our side.
As we weave through this march that has taken over Midtown Manhattan, tens of thousands out in full force, coming across all different sorts of diverse groups.
Number one way to fight climate change, go vegan.
I'm Susan DeGeorge, and I'm with both Green Faith and with Hudson River Presbytery. We have everybody from Jains, Sikhs, Buddhists, Hindus, Catholics, Protestants, atheists, agnostics, all marching in the group.
Climate justice, when do we want it now?
My name is Kaylin Callahan. I'm from Rockaway Beach, and I'm an organizer with Rockaway Wildfire. Superstorm Sandy devastated the Rockaway Peninsula. We know that climate change is being worsened and exacerbated by all of the systemic profiteering that's happening throughout our world, and it's time for that to stop. If you haven't been involved in climate justice activism before, it's time to get involved in climate justice activism because this is affecting all of us.
My name is Braden Elliott. I'm a PhD student at Dartmouth College, and I'm here because I care.
And the banner under which the scientists are marching is "The debate is over"?
Correct. The banner says the debate is over because the core part, the part that the planet is warming and the humans are responsible for the lion's share of it, is settled. There's always debate to be had on the edges of a large topic, but the call to action is very clear.
And now we're in the block of demonstrators under the banner of "We know who is responsible." Anti-corporate campaigners, peace and justice groups, those who are organizing against the groups they say are holding back progress.
My name's Sandra Nurse. I'm here with the Flood Wall Street contingent. We're calling on people to do a mass sit-in in the financial district to highlight the connections between corporate capitalism, extractive industries, the financing and bankrolling of climate change, the financing of politicians who will not bring meaningful legislation to the table and who are blocking the process of actually bringing meaningful legislation against climate change.
Millions of people around the world gather in the largest climate action march in history.
The biggest gathering seeking to address climate change ever.
2,000 rallies in 162 countries, from Paris, Melbourne, Australia, Rio de Janeiro.
Activists are filling the streets to demand action on climate change.
We are here because we are redefining this moment, this movement, this time. I want to thank all of the marchers today for coming together and taking a stand. We need you.
Also a massive people's march. I hope the leaders of the world listened.
We're the first generation to feel the impacts of climate change and the last that can do anything about it.
Time is running out.
Don't give up the fight. Our citizens keep marching. We cannot pretend we do not hear them. We have to answer the call.
The United Nations Secretary-General has called for world leaders to make bold pledges and sign up to a new global agreement on climate change next year. Speaking as the UN Climate Change Summit opened in New York, he said carbon emissions had to be reduced to limit global temperature rises, citing public pressure seen at the weekend's demonstrations.
In cities around the world, hundreds of thousands of people called for action. They demanded that leaders lead. That is why we are here today. We are not here to talk. We are here to make history. Today, thank you for your leadership. Thank you.
He called for $100 billion a year from governments for a global fund. France has joined Germany in pledging $1 billion. Actor Leonardo DiCaprio, now a UN climate change representative, called for more investment in renewable energy.
We need to put a price tag on carbon emissions and eliminate government subsidies for oil, coal and gas companies. We need to end the free ride that industrial polluters have been given in the name of a free market economy. They do not deserve our tax dollars. They deserve our scrutiny, for the economy itself will die if our ecosystems collapse.
On Monday night, about 1,000 activists blocked parts of New York's Broadway. Organisers said the protest targeted what they called corporate polluters and those profiting from the fossil fuel industry.
A landmark moment in Paris.
The governments of the world have a plan to reduce climate-changing greenhouse gas emissions after 2 decades of trying.
This agreement should be the turning point in our story.
Even if all the initial targets set in Paris are met, we'll only be part of the way there.
Grow, little things, big things, grow.
Far more needs to be done to keep global warming in check.
We are fundamentally running out of time.
Human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. No social advance rolls in on the wheels of inevitability. I have a dream today.
What's radical is to write off the fact that change is within our reach.
We, as everyday people, have so much power.
Losing my future is not like losing an election or a few points on the stock market.
This climate disobedience does not make us hooligans. It is our sacred duty to those suffering in the present day and who stand to lose so much if we fail in this race against time.
Let's take a moment to hear our hearts beat! To hear our hearts beat! Everybody together! Everybody together! People! Power! People! Power! People! Power! People! Power! People!
We can stop this madness right now, right here.
Free at last! Free at last!
First, today's Energy Independence Action calls for an immediate reevaluation of the so-called Clean Power Plan. Second, we are lifting the ban on federal leasing for coal production. Third, we are lifting job-killing restrictions on the production of oil, natural gas, clean coal, and shale energy.
We come today to say the energy companies and politicians are lying about climate change.
We won't go away. Welcome to your 100th day. There were 200,000 people marching in the streets today.
We stand!
We stand!
For the water!
For the water! Keep it in the sun.
Will surround the White House with tens of thousands of people.
The whole earth is sitting down at this moment. Catch your heart.
Take a deep breath of air. You are fighting for that.